Chairman Begeman, Vice Chairman Miller, it's an honor to be here today. My name is John Risch, and I'm the elected National Legislative Director for the Smart Transportation Division, the largest of the rail unions in an industry that's about 90% organized. I worked as a locomotive engineer for 30 years, and I'm elected to the position I serve in today. On the CSX, I represent the conductors, brakemen, a lot of the engineers, switchmen, and yard masters, the operating employees. So my remarks here will come from information I've gotten from the field, and I'm really going to focus on just one aspect of why we believe these service disruptions are as severe as they are. And the aspect I'm going to focus on is the long trains that CSX is running. In recent months, CSX has been building and operating extremely long trains, some of them 2 to 3 miles in length. And these long trains, and historically in America, trains are about 1 mile to 1.5 miles long. But these 2 to 3 mile long trains cause lots and lots of issues in operations. First of all, a 3 mile long train is far heavier, has a lot more in-train forces. It takes a lot longer to get up to track speed, if it ever gets up to track speed. And when you go from spot to spot and you have to reduce the speed of this train and then increase it, it takes far longer to slow it down and far longer to get it back up to whatever the maximum speed that train is going to be. Most often, it is not track speed. Most rail lines in America are single track main line, meaning they have to have sidings on them for one train to meet an opposing train. When a train is too long for the siding, we have what's called a saw-by. The train heads into the siding, the opposing train waits on the main line, stops, and then the train that headed into the siding heads back out. If both trains are too long for the siding, we have what's called a double saw-by. And to see how you can get by one train by the other in that situation, you can Google a little demonstration on YouTube, and it's a disaster, and it'll take several hours for that to take place. But train operations also, modern train operations, of course, don't have cabooses. We don't have cabooses, but the head of the train has to keep constant communications with the rear end of the train, whether it be distributed power on the rear end of the train or what we call a telemetry device or rear end device, constantly communicating back and forth. I, as a railroad engineer, would need to watch to make sure that my air brake pressure is up to snuff on the back of the train. If it was an emergency situation, I could dynamite the air or set the air on both ends of the train at the same time. So this constant communication is required by regulation and by CSX rule. The longer the train, the more you lose communications with the rear end of your train. And when that happens, by CSX rules, you're required to reduce the speed of that train to 30 miles an hour. If it's in a graded territory, and that means that more than a 2% grade, that train has to stop and comply with other procedures. I have one instance, and I'm going to submit a lot of different stories for the record, one instance where they had communication failure more than 60 times on one run. So they're constantly slowing the train down to 30 miles an hour because the length of the train doesn't allow the radio to communicate that far. The longer the train, the higher probability of mechanical failure. It's as simple as that. The more cars, the more problems. In addition, like I mentioned before, there's slack action. All these trains have a little slack between each cars, and the longer the train goes, the more slack action where the train cars run in and they run out, many times causing derailments. The derailment last week in Atlanta was a 177 car long train, more than 2 miles long. I don't know why it derailed, but it could very well have been the in-train forces in the train that caused that train to derail. But when a train is disabled for whatever reason, it might be a derailment, it might be just that it broke in two, it might be that an air hose separated, the conductor is forced then, has to leave the lead locomotive and head back to investigate what the problem is. When he's back there with his portable railroad radio, we find that those portable radios are good for about 8,000 feet. The problem is, so he gets out there 8,000 feet or more looking for the problem so he can try and address the problem. It gets beyond 8,000 feet, and he's no longer able to communicate with the locomotive engineers. He might have to put together, take a knuckle out of a car, replace a knuckle or whatever, but in order to communicate with the locomotive engineer, he'll have to walk back up again to get within range of his radio in order to make this communications. Causes tremendous amounts delay. And the longer the train, the harder it is to keep up our brake pipe pressure. I'm from North Dakota, and it cools off there once in a while, and CSX, of course, runs all the way up to New York, to Florida, and other places. But the colder the weather, the harder it is to maintain air brake pipe pressure. When the pressure drops, the cars on the train will automatically apply on their own. So these long trains make it far more challenging to keep the air pressure up and the train moving at what we'd hope to be close to maximum authorized speed, but seldom is because they're far too long. The other thing is many of these CSX engineers are not experienced with handling these super long trains. And as a railroad engineer myself for 30 years, I've operated several of these pretty long trains, and it's a whole different ballgame. Sometimes part of your train is going uphill, part of your train is going downhill, it's slack action is moving in and out, things of that nature. So it's difficult. We've got numerous instances where these trains have been breaking two. One of them was in Florida, and a relatively new engineer left a station in Florida, and I've got the example that I'll submit for the record. Left, train broke in two several times. The last time it broke in two, he blocked an Amtrak passenger train for 9 hours in a siding in the state of Florida. Another problem is when trains travel down the track, they go by wayside warning detectors. These detectors monitor every car. They'll see if one of the cars is making a lot of noise, or if there's a hot bearing or a hot wheel or something like that. Once you get out beyond about 13,000 feet, the train crew cannot hear. Oftentimes the radio from the detector does not transfer far enough where the crew can hear whether or not their train is safe to proceed. When that happens, you have to stop the train and ascertain through the dispatcher whether or not the reading was okay to proceed or not. Brake pipe tests. All trains have to have brake pipe tests. Some of the brake pipe tests require that the train be walked. So if you have a 3-mile long train and the conductor has to walk 3 miles with the radio that does not work after 8,000 feet and then walk back 3 miles, you can about imagine how long you've delayed that train and how many crossings you've blocked while you were doing this. We've got instances where trains are too large for foreign rail yard. It's bad enough when a train goes into a CSX yard and it's far too long for the yard. They have to double over to 2 or more tracks, and that clogs up the yard and it causes congestion in the yard. But the example I have is the Beltway Railroad of Chicago only accepts 8,000-foot long trains. However, CSX keeps sending trains that are 9,000 feet or more, and they're rejected. Once they're rejected, the crew has to take it over to Bar Yard and set out enough cars to get down below 8,000 feet, and then return to the Beltway of Chicago. So I guess the question of the day is, what can be done about it? I wrote the Federal Railroad Administration in April of this year about concerns about these super long trains and the problems they're having in regards to safety, blocking crossings, things of that nature. I've gotten no response. We have no FRA administrator. We have one in the wings, but he's not been confirmed, and they're reluctant to do anything over there. So my recommendation to the STB is to issue an order. Issue an order to the CSX and other railroads that you cannot operate a train that's longer than the sidings on the single-track main lines in which you're traveling. And if you feel uncomfortable doing that, you certainly have the power to investigate. So we urge the Surface Transportation Board to conduct an investigation of the effects long train lengths has on customer service and safety in the industry. In closing, I just want to say that I was sitting in the back there, and one of my members texted me from Kentucky, and he said that there's a terminal there where the train masters have now just declared today that there will be no more overtime for road switchers or local service operations. So if you're out there and you're on a road switcher and you have customers to service and it will result in overtime, you're to ignore the work and head back to the terminal. So I'll try and figure out exactly where that's taking place, but that happened today. That concludes my remarks. It's an honor to be here today, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you all. You may be the fifth panel, but you certainly are as important as the first. Mr. Risch, so there's no actual FRA limit to the length of a train?
There is no FRA limit to the length of
So
a train.
the limit is the, I guess, the creativity of the...
Whatever you can drag down the rail.
And how many locomotives do you need for a 3-mile train?
Well, you can, it depends on the weight of the car and the train more than anything. But you can drag quite a few cars around with 2 locomotives. You're just not going to go very fast. The more locomotives you put on, of course, the better opportunity you'll have to get it up to speed. But many times we see not very many locomotives, and yeah, they're not going track speed.
Keep 3-mile trains off the Elston Yard line, please.
And out of Kansas. Like way too many block crossings. Linda, I had a